Thomas Grieve, Isabel Haldane, Christian Harlow, Marion Henderson, Margaret Hormscliffe, Janet Keary, Margaret Kinnell, Bessie Logie, Margaret Marshall, Janet Robertson, Janet Robeson, Bessie Smythe, Beatrix Thompson, Janet Trail, John Young, Unknown, Witches, Witches. Janet Aitchison, Catherine Blair, Marion Boyd, Isabel Cutis, Maribel Cowper, Alexander Clark, Janet Dunbar, Helen Ezett, Isabel Faulkner, William Faulkner, Marion Farrisdale, Elspeth Ferguson, Barbara Flint, Christian Gow, Christian Hay, Elspeth Jameson, David Langlanthus, Archibald Liddell, Jean Lyleburn, Margaret Melrose, Effie McBroom, Janet McKinley, Marion McClintock, Margaret Newcross, Elspeth Paris. Marjorie Rowand, Anna Smith, Marion Stirk, Marion Simpson, Annie Taylor, Janet Torr and Janet Torr, Janet Umfra, Maisie Umfra, Janet Watt, Marjorie Patterson, Gowan Anderson, Walter Baird, Helen Birrell, Janet Budge, Agnes Carroll, Annabel Cattenhead, Margaret Keirich, Janet Dempster, Helen Dalrymple, John Davy, Helen Dryborough, Agnes Jury, John Findlaw, Agnes Forbes, Elspeth Herold, Patrick Landrock, Mary Lochte, Isabel Leslie, Isabel Moore, Annis Monk, Cummer Mutton, Margaret McConaughey, Elspeth Nielsen, Janet Pirrie, John Proctor, Janet Peddy, Marion White, Euphemie Ridd, Janet Robbie, Elizabeth Ross, Janet Stark, Margaret Thompson, Margaret Turner, Helen Wilson, Bessie Wright, William Young, Unknown Helen, Unknown Janet, Unknown sister of Agnes Forbes, Unknown wife of John McConaughey, Walter Baird, Bessie Brune, Agnes Carl, Annabel Cattenhead, Christian Craig, Catherine Christie, Margaret Dalgleish, Euphemie Dolling, John Davy, Janet Doverty, Margaret Jury, Nance Jury, Margaret Henderson, Margaret King, Alexander Mowat, Alexander Ronaldson, Isabel Smythe, Margaret Utney, Agnes Bott, John Hogg, Agnes Archer, Janet Aitchison, Christian Aikenhead, Bessie Archer, Margaret Bain, Elspeth Baird, Margaret Barrowman, Marion Bathcat, Margaret Baxter, Helen Blake, George Blythe, Janet Boyd, Janet Boyd, Catherine Brown, Margaret Burgess, Bessie Carryle, Alison Chapman, Agnes Charters, Margaret Cowan, Beatrix Cuthbertson, William Daggeris, Janet Darling, William Davidson, Agnes Dempster, Alison Dempster, Agnes Nean Donald, Elspeth Duncan, Agnes Dungleson, Marion George, Marion Nean Gilly Michael, Helen Gow, Alexander Hamilton, Agnes Henderson, Effie Herring, Elspeth Hislop, Isabel Howitson, Janet Ireland, Margaret Joe, Sarah Keith, Catherine Leatham, Agnes Liddell, Lord Lichterwood, Bessie Little, Stephen Malcolm, Barbara Matthey, Agnes Meldrum, Margaret Melross, Isabel Miller, Marion Mitchell, Margaret Moss, Margaret Muirhead, John Macready, Mary McClintock, Margaret Oliver, Catherine Oswald, Marion Porteous, Agnes Rankin, Janet Reaney, Janet Reid, Bessie Riddle, Margaret Ridpeth. Janet Shillington, Marion Shearer, Elspeth Simpson, Janet Smybeard, Margaret Stewart, Catherine Stewart, Bessie Stobie, Mosey Stone, Janet Stockin, John Taylor, Alison Taylor, Christian Taylor, Isabel Thompson, Jonet Thompson, Mally Turner, Janet Eunice, Margaret Eunice, William Watt, Janet Wheel, Bessie Wright, Janet Wright, Catherine Young, Margaret Young, unknown mother of James Smith, unknown. Agnes Adam, John Adam, Janet Aitchison, Agnes Allen, Janet Allen, Catherine Alexander, Margaret Alexander, Bessie Aiken, Margaret Anderson, Michael Ariskin, Catherine Nian Rob Orchty, Margaret Ballim, Janet Barclay, Janet Baxter, Isabel Bain, Helen Beattie, Margaret Bellany, Janet Bishop. Grisel Boyle, Alison Borthwick, Janet Bowmaker, Janet Boyd, Marion Boyd, Isabel Boyne, Janet Brodie, Janet Brotherstons, Catherine Brune, Margaret Burgess, Agnes Campbell. Bessie Carfer, John Carfer, Thomas Carfer, Alison Carrick, Agnes Chalmers, Jean Cleland, Janet Clerkson, Elspeth Culsiter, Margaret Cuthbertson, Beatrix Crichton, Adam Christie, John Christie, Catherine Christie, Marion Crosser, Elspeth Christie, Bessie Cumroy, Isabel Cunningham, Janet Dick, Margaret Dixon, Janet Donald, Margaret Donald, Janet Dow, Alexander Drummond, Isabel Dryborough, Agnes Duddingston, Elspeth Dunbar, Bessie Duncan, Euphemie Dundas, Marie Nian Ian Ear, Susanna Elphinston, Samuel Fairley, Agnes Faulkner, Margaret Fisher, Barbara Flint, Janet Forsyth, James Frame, Bessie Fraser, Helen Gaston, Margaret Gowanlock, John Graham, also known as Joke the Graham, Isabel Gray, John Greenshields, Marion Gridge, Isabel Haddock, Margaret Hamilton, Janet Hardy, Marion Hardy, John Hasbin, Margaret Hasty, Alexander Hay, Janet Henderson and Janet Henderson, Bessie Hepburn, Janet Hill, Gilbert Hogg, John Hogg, Manson Hutchin, Helen Hulday, Alexander Hunter, Margaret Hutchison, Margaret Johnston, Mary Johnston, Sarah Keith, Margaret Kennedy, Janet Kerr, Catherine King, Catherine Kirkton, Helen Knight, Janet Knight, Bessie Lauder, Catherine Lauder, Janet Liddell, Patrick Linton, Margaret Loch, Helen Ludis, Joni Lindsay, Catherine Marshall, Bessie Make, Lady Manderson, Hutchin Manson, Margaret Matheson, William Matheson, Margaret Maxwell, Bessie Main, Janet Melrose, Catherine Mempherson, Sarah Meslet, Margaret Melvis, Margaret Mitchell, Janet Miller, Jean Miller, Janet Minto, Easter Morris, Helen McPherson, Janet Neal, Grada Gneinchat, Margaret Nicholson, David Nisbet, Catherine Oswald, Margaret Patterson, Janet Pennycook, Marion Porteous, Robert Pratt, Alison Pringle, Annie Purdy, Anne Purcell, Janet Purcell, Isabel White, Agnes Rannick, Janet Rendell, Thomas Richardson, Gelly Robson, Agnes Robson, Isabel Rutherford, Marion Sanderson, Marion Shaler, Janet Shearer, Helen Scott, Janet Scott, Margaret Semple. Helen Simpson, Agnes Sinclair, Alison Sinclair, George Sinclair, Patrick Sinclair. Susanna Skateston, Bessie Slay, Margaret Small, Margaret Sproul, Elizabeth Stephen, William Stevenson, Thomas Stoddart, Margaret Straff, Margaret Strudgeon, Marion Taylor, Donald Thompson, Isabel Thompson, Jean Thompson, Agnes Thompson, Christian Thompson, Isabel Thompson, Janet Thompson, William Thompson, Mally Forbrand, Elizabeth Hoare, Agnes Wallace, Beatrice Wallace, Margaret Wallace and Margaret Wallace, Jean Watson, Thomas Watson, Janet Weir, Catherine Weems, Janet Widrow, Janet Williamson, Alison Wilson, Agnes Wilson, Janet Wallace, Margaret Wilson, Christine Wilson, Barbara Ward, Catherine Ward, Isabel Wright, Catherine Yerkin, Isabel Young and Isabel Young, Catherine Young. Unknown, unknown, unknown. Unknown daughter of Janet Henrys. Unknown woman accused of witchcraft. Unknown James. Unknown Julianne. Unknown Young. Unknown Wilson. Andrew Abel. Marg Affleck. Margaret Allen. Janet Anderson. Margaret Anderson and Margaret Anderson. Marion Anderson. Mosey Alloswain. Marion Arowan, Alexander Bailey, Walter Bade, Crystal Balloch, Marion Banks, Helen Beattie, Janet Beveridge, Elspeth Bladderstons, Helen Bissett, Helen Boyd, Margaret Borthwick, William Brune, Janet Buchan, Margaret Callender, Alison Carrick, Susanna Chancellor, Janet Clark, Alison Collin, Malik Cowper, Alison Cowan, Catherine Christie, Janet Curry, Bessie Dalgleish, Margaret Dasson. Janet Davidson, Bessie Duncan, Michael Erskine, Janet Ferguson, Margaret Fisher, Gowan Forsyth, Janet Galbraith, Margaret Gilchrist, Catherine Gilmore, Bessie Gladale, Thompson Grigg, Bessie Giddale, Margaret Halliday, James Hall, Marion Haney, Alexander Hamilton and Alexander Hamilton, Marion Hardy, Margaret Herriot, Janet Herries, Marion Johnston, Sarah Keith, Janet Kerr, Agnes Kirkpatrick, Catherine Kirkton, Catherine Knox, Agnes Lauder, Margaret Lumsden, Catherine Major, Helen Manderston, Marion Martin, Margaret Maxwell, Janet Mitchell, Bessie Mitchell, Isabel Moffat, Janet Moyer, Dodd Neen Saik Moy, Patrick Murray, Catherine McShane, Janet McGillichan, Isabel McNaught, John Neal and John Neal, Ellie Nesbitt, Alison Neving, Bessie Nesbitt, Janet Patterson, Agnes Fenwick, John Fenwick, John Ray, Janet Reid, Janet Richardson, Margaret Ridd, Margaret Ritchie, Marion Ritchie, Janet Robson, Lady Samuelston, Janet Scott, Mally Scott, Elizabeth Selkirk, George Semmel, Robert Simpson, Janet Sinclair, Margaret Small, Janet Smealy, John Smith, Christian Steele, Giles Swinton, Patrick Todd, Agnes Thompson, Isabel Thompson, Jean Thompson, Nicole Thompson, Margaret Veitch, Janet Wallace, Catherine Watson, Elspeth Watson, Agnes Spear, Margaret White, Janet Wilkie, Katie Wilson, Janet Wilson, Catherine Wilson. Unknown, unknown, unknown. Unknown wife of Matthew Will. Unknown Cowie, unknown wife of Wilson. Andrew Aitken, Patrick Christensen, Mally Cowper, Janet Elder, Gillis Gould, Effie Lindsay, Catherine Lyle, Catherine Miller, Thomas Murray, Elspeth McCann, Mary Neil McConnell, Mary McGill-Michael, John Neal and John Neal, Catherine Patterson, Christian Patterson, John Phillip, Bessie Purcell, Christian Reich, Marion Edgy, Catherine Scott, Catherine Simpson, Marion Simpson, John Smith, Isabel Trey, William Watt, Elspeth Watson, Janet Woodrow, Catherine Wilson, Unknown Walker. Barbara Young, several people, Agnes Downey and Agnes, Jean Crawford, Isabel Jury, Maisie Fellowsdale, Isabel Hall, Margaret Hall, Helen Hamilton, Marion Hill, Bessie Jaffrey, Isabel Kelso, Janet Kerr, Christian Lindsay, Janet Love, Marion Lumsden, Marion Muir, John McKincaid, Alison Nisbet, Janet Rank, Catherine Simpson, Janet Smith, Catherine Tom, Ellison Woodrow, William Watt, Helena Woodrow, Margaret Woodrow, Marion Woodrow. Unknown gardener's wife, unknown. Agnes Allen Shaw, Alison Bailey, William Baird, Thomas Carlipis, Margaret Chapman, William Coke, Sir John Colquhoun, Alison Dick, Catherine Ewan, Margaret Fraser, Catherine Nian Dan Gillihallam, Catherine Grieve, Helen Keir, James Narston, Marion Leyland, Janet Matthey, Marion Matthey, Catherine Miller, Janet Oig, Isabel Sinclair, John Sinclair, Alistair Smith, Bessie Skeepster, Agnes Sutherland, Janet Taylor, Fingwell Nian Tilgar, John Alistair Watton, William Weems, Catherine Wilson, Helen Neen Dulwreak, Margaret Neen Dulwreak, Grisel Astron, Elizabeth Bathcote, Margaret Bellamy, Giles Chalmer, Agnes Christie, Janet Dusson, George Fraser, Henry Hoggart, William Mearns, Agnes Gilpatrick, Margaret Neen Dan McCool, Margaret Neen Fail, Helen Rowan, Kath Rowan, Isabel Sinclair, Patrick Smith, Janet Taylor, The Witch of Monza, Janet Williamson, Agnes Wilson, Alison Wilson, Elspeth Wilson, Janet Phyllis, Helen Ibster, Bessie Johnston, Elspeth Lyle, Margaret Rudge, Margaret Sanderson, Anna Tate, Agnes Bathcote, Annie Bain, Urshan Carfer, and Margaret Dow.